A few days ago, I asked people in the comments what they pictured the moment they heard the word ghoul, and almost every single reply described the same thing: a rotting wanderer with hollow eyes and gray skin, something pulled straight out of a survival video game or a tabletop monster manual, shuffling toward the nearest living thing it could find. Not one comment came close to the creature that actually carried that name in the oldest surviving stories. The real ghoul has almost nothing in common with the thing wearing its name today, and once you learn where it actually came from, the original version starts to feel like the more unsettling one, not the tamer one. So where did the ghoul actually begin? And how did something so different end up looking so familiar? Let us go back to the place the word was born, long before it ever reached a screen. Night falls fast once the sun drops behind the dunes. The heat bleeds out of the sand within minutes, the wind picks up, and the last landmark a traveler was using to navigate stops making sense in the dark. A water skin is already half empty. Footprints from an hour ago have already vanished under a thin drift of sand.
And somewhere along the ridgeline, just at the edge of what the eye can still make out, something is moving at exactly the same pace as the traveler below, neither closing the distance nor falling behind. That is the world the ghoul was born into, not a haunted house, not a locked crypt, but exactly this: open ground with no fixed points and no way to call for help. The word ghoul comes from the Arabic ghoul, and most scholars trace it to the root gala, meaning to seize or to snatch something away. That single detail already tells you something important about the creature. It was never defined by rot or decay the way modern versions are. It was defined by an action, by the exact moment it took something from you, whether that was your life, your sense of direction, or simply your certainty about who was really walking beside you. Interestingly, the same root shows up once in the Quran, in a verse describing a drink served in paradise that carries no ghoul in it, meaning no headache and no loss of the senses. The meaning there is completely harmless, but the shared root is a small reminder of how central the idea of seizing or overwhelming someone was to the word from the very beginning, long before it settled into naming a monster. It helps to understand that the ghoul did not appear in isolation. The same desert that produced it also produced a whole vocabulary of uncertainty. The heat bends the horizon into something unstable. Water seems to pool in the distance where no water exists, and a shape on the ridgeline could be a rock, a person, or nothing at all, impossible to tell apart until it moves. Add a sudden sandstorm capable of erasing a path within minutes, and a stretch of terrain that looks identical for kilometers in every direction, and you have a landscape that could already trick the eye and swallow a person's sense of direction entirely on its own, long before any creature ever entered the picture. That is fertile ground for a predator whose entire method depends on deception rather than force. The ghoul was not an outside threat layered onto a neutral setting. It grew directly out of the specific ways the desert itself could already betray a traveler. The earliest traces of the ghoul appear in pre-Islamic Bedouin poetry, composed by desert poets who lived and traveled across Arabia centuries before the word ever reached Europe. One of the most cited among them, a poet known by the name Ta'abata Sharan, described encountering a ghoul along a desert route and treated it as a real and present danger rather than a piece of folklore meant only to frighten children by the fire. To understand why that mattered, you have to think about what travel across Arabia actually meant at the time. There were no settlements every few kilometers, no lit roads, no way to send word ahead if something went wrong. Crossing between towns could take days, sometimes far longer, through open desert where heat, terrain, and simple bad luck could kill a traveler just as easily as any predator could. Wandering off the path was not a small mistake. It could be the last one a person ever made. In a landscape like that, the fear that took root was not about a locked door creaking at night. It was about the empty stretch of road ahead, the ruins nobody could explain, and the stranger who appeared exactly when you needed one the most. Before going any further, it helps to place the ghoul inside the wider system of belief it belongs to, because in nearly every serious source, the ghoul is treated as a category of jinn, and the jinn are almost nothing like the wish-granting genie most people picture today.
In pre-Islamic and later Islamic tradition, jinn are described as beings created from a smokeless flame, existing in a world that runs alongside our own, rather than hidden away inside a lamp. They are not a single creature, but an entire population, with their own communities, their own temperaments, and, according to belief, their own capacity for both good and harm, not unlike people. Within that population, the ghoul is placed among the most dangerous kind, and in later Islamic folklore, it is even described as an offspring of Iblis, the figure representing evil in Islamic tradition. Some scholars treat the ghoul as a distinct type of jinn. Others describe it more like a role that any jinn can fall into, since the ones that turn toward preying on travelers and feeding on the dead earn the name through what they do, the same way a person's actions can shape their reputation more than their origin ever could. These stories were rarely told for entertainment alone. Bedouin communities relied heavily on oral tradition to pass down practical knowledge, and warnings about the ghoul functioned as a kind of survival lesson dressed up as folklore, repeated to young travelers before their first long journey across unfamiliar territory. A tale about a stranger who turns out not to be a stranger at all carries an obvious lesson underneath it. Be careful who you trust once the last landmark disappears behind you. That is part of why the ghoul appears so consistently across such a wide stretch of pre-Islamic poetry, rather than in just one isolated tale. It was less a single story and more a shared cultural reflex, a way of encoding real danger into something memorable enough to repeat around a fire. There is one more detail that almost never survives into modern retellings, and it changes the entire tone of the earliest stories. In many of the oldest sources, the ghoul was considered primarily a female figure, sometimes called Ghula, roughly meaning mother ghoul, or addressed through other respectful family terms depending on the region telling the story. A male form existed too, but the female version dominated the earliest oral tradition, especially in tales passed specifically to young women, as a kind of cautionary lesson about the world beyond the family camp. That single detail tells you the ghoul was never built as a simple monster meant to end a story quickly. It was built as a warning, wrapped inside a shape that could look however it needed to look in order to get close enough to matter. If the ghoul could look like almost anyone, how would a traveler ever know they were in danger before it was too late? According to the old sources, there was exactly one detail the creature could never fully disguise, no matter what shape it borrowed. Its feet stayed the feet of a donkey. Underneath a stranger's face, a beautiful woman's face, or even a familiar-looking traveler's face, the hooves remained. And if a person happened to be calm enough and observant enough to glance down, that was the single flaw in an otherwise convincing performance. Most people, understandably, were not paying that kind of attention while lost and frightened somewhere in open desert at night. And the hooves were not even the strangest rule attached to this creature. The ghoul most often appeared in the guise of an attractive woman, approaching lone travelers on quiet stretches of road, offering company, a fire, sometimes even shelter for the night. The stories rarely show the creature attacking on sight. Instead, it works through patience and persuasion, coaxing a person off the safe path and deeper into unfamiliar ground before revealing anything close to its true nature. By the time the disguise finally dropped, the traveler was usually already too far from any real help for that discovery to matter. Worth mentioning here is a close relative from the same folklore, a jinn called the Sila, sometimes confused with the ghoul in later retellings. Where the ghoul could shift its shape freely, the Sila kept a single fixed form, and some versions describe it as closer to a witch than a shapeshifter. The two got tangled together across centuries of oral retelling, which is part of why descriptions of the ghoul itself became so inconsistent depending on which storyteller or region you happen to be listening to. Western scholars encountering these stories centuries later often reached for the closest creature their own folklore had to offer, and more than once that comparison landed on the European ogre, a solitary being that also lures and consumes the unwary. It is a rough comparison at best, since the ogre of European fairy tales rarely carries the shape-shifting or the desert setting that defines the ghoul. But the instinct to place it in a familiar category says a lot about how differently the two traditions handled their monsters, and it is a comparison that resurfaces later in this story in a very literal way. Killing a ghoul, according to the old accounts, followed one very specific and very strange rule. A person was allowed exactly one strike. A single decisive blow could end the creature for good. A second blow, delivered out of panic or hesitation, or simply the instinct to make sure, would undo the first entirely and bring it back to life. Sit with what that detail actually demands of a person in that moment. It is not testing raw strength or the right weapon. It is testing composure, whether someone can stay steady enough in the single worst moment of their life to act exactly once and then stop themselves from acting again. That is a very different kind of fear than simply outrunning something with claws, and it says a great deal about what these stories were actually training people to value: patience under pressure rather than brute force. But none of this explains where a creature with such oddly specific rules actually came from in the first place. So where does a creature built around all of this actually come from originally? And is Arabia really where the idea begins? Some researchers, including the scholar Ahmed al-Rawi, have proposed a deeper and much older route, tracing a possible connection back to Mesopotamian mythology, specifically to a class of demonic beings called Ghalu. In surviving Akkadian and Sumerian material, the Ghalu were underworld demons tied to the myth of Dumuzid and Inanna, sent to seize the shepherd god Dumuzid and drag him down to the underworld in his wife's place, a story built entirely around the horror of being taken from the world of the living without warning or ceremony. According to this theory, centuries of contact between Bedouin traders and Mesopotamian civilizations may have allowed pieces of that older belief to travel south and blend into the folklore developing across the Arabian Peninsula. If that connection holds, the ghoul is not simply a product of desert isolation. It may be one branch of a far older idea about death, the underworld, and beings that cross the boundary between the two. An idea that keeps resurfacing across ancient cultures that otherwise had very little contact with one another. Whatever its deepest roots, by the time the ghoul reached North Africa, it slotted comfortably into an already rich Berber tradition, full of its own demons and desert spirits, absorbed and reshaped yet again the way folklore tends to travel wherever people do. Even today, in everyday spoken Arabic, the word survives in a much smaller and more domestic form. It is still used to describe someone with a monstrous or endless appetite, and in some communities, parents still invoke the word to keep children from wandering off or misbehaving, a small surviving fragment of the old fear, folded quietly into ordinary language. But there is one part of the ghoul story that almost everyone today assumes has always been there, and it turns out that assumption is nearly the opposite of true. Everything covered so far already breaks from the popular image of the ghoul: the donkey hooves, the female tradition, the single blow rule, the possible Mesopotamian roots reaching back further than Arabia itself. But the next detail is the one that tends to surprise people the most, because it overturns the one trait almost everyone assumes has defined the creature from the very beginning. Ask anyone today what a ghoul actually does, and graveyards come up almost immediately, digging up bodies, lurking among headstones, feeding on the dead in the dark. It feels like the single most obvious trait the creature has ever had. And that is exactly why it is worth pausing on, because researchers who have gone back through Arabic sources predating the 1700s have found that corpse eating in cemeteries does not actually appear as an established trait of the ghoul in that older material. The creature preyed on the living. It misled travelers on open roads. When the old poetry describes an encounter, the danger is almost always about the journey itself, never about a graveyard. So where did the version everyone now associates with the ghoul actually come from? The answer traces back to one man and one specific translation. In the early 1700s, a French scholar named Antoine Galland produced the first European translation of the collection known as 1001 Nights, published across 12 volumes between 1704 and 1717. Galland was not simply translating word for word. Scholars who have studied his surviving manuscripts describe him as having freely added, cut, and reshaped material to suit a French readership hungry for something exotic and thrilling. The only ghoul story present in the older core material at that point was a tale called The King's Son and the She-Ghoul, and in an interesting twist, Galland actually translated that creature using the French word for ogress rather than keeping the original term, treating it more like a European fairy tale monster than something distinctly Arabic. The real turning point came from someone history nearly forgot to credit at all. A Syrian storyteller named Hannah Diab, visiting Galland in Paris in the early 1700s, shared an entirely separate set of tales that were not part of the original manuscript, tales that went on to give the West some of its most famous stories, Aladdin among them. For roughly 3 centuries, Diab's contribution was reduced to a passing mention in Galland's own diary, while Galland alone received credit as author of the tales. That changed only after Diab's personal memoir surfaced in the 1990s, giving historians their first real look at the storyteller behind some of the collection's most enduring material, and finally restoring his name to a story he had been quietly written out of for generations. Among the material Diab provided was a story now known as The Tale of Sidi Numan, which Galland published around 1712. This time, Galland kept the original word ghoul and added an explanation for readers who had never encountered the term before. It was this story, not the older core material, that introduced Europe to the image of a ghoul digging through a graveyard, and the image stuck so firmly that within a few generations, almost nobody remembered the creature had ever meant anything else. The tale was enormously popular across the West for a long stretch afterward, right up through the early 20th century, though today it has quietly slipped out of most modern retellings of the collection entirely. The story itself is worth telling properly because most modern summaries strip out the very details that made it work. A young man named Sidi Numan marries a woman named Amina, drawn in by her beauty and her composed, quiet manner. At their very first meal together, something feels slightly off. Instead of eating normally, Amina takes out a small case, removes a thin pin, and picks up her rice one single grain at a time, eating almost nothing at all. Numan assumes it is simply a delicate appetite and lets the matter go. But the pattern never changes, meal after meal, and Amina never once looks weak or unwell because of it. If anything, she seems completely untouched by hunger, healthy in every visible way. Curious and increasingly uneasy, he pretends to fall asleep one night and waits. Eventually, Amina rises quietly, dresses, and slips out into the moonlit streets, clearly trying not to wake him. He follows at a careful distance, staying far enough back that his own footsteps never give him away, all the way to a cemetery at the edge of the city where the moonlight leaves the rows of graves clearly visible. Hidden against a low wall, he watches his wife meet a ghoul among the headstones. Together, the two of them dig up a body buried that same day and sit calmly at the graveside, sharing the meal between them, as though it were the most ordinary evening in the world. When Numan finally confronts Amina about what he witnessed, she does not deny any of it, and reveals herself to be a sorceress with a considerable set of abilities of her own. In a fury, she strikes him and transforms him into a dog, driving him out onto the street to fend for himself. In the version passed down through Galland, this is not where the story ends. A kind woman eventually recognizes something human still trapped inside the frightened animal, and with the help of her own daughter, who happens to be a skilled magician herself, restores Numan to his human form. Rather than simply walking away afterward, he returns for a kind of justice, and with guidance from the women who helped him, turns the tables on Amina, transforming her into a mare in front of witnesses. The whole tale is framed as Numan recounting these events directly to the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, which is part of why the story carries so much weight within the larger collection surrounding it. What makes this version so different from the simplified one that circulates online today is not just the accuracy of the names or the smaller details, it is the actual shape of the horror underneath it. The monster in this story is never really the ghoul waiting out in the graveyard. It is the person Numan thought he knew completely, sharing meals, sharing a home, sharing a bed, while keeping an entire second life hidden in plain sight the whole time. The ghoul in the cemetery barely has to do anything at all in this tale. Amina is doing the frightening part entirely on her own.
A story about a woman with a secret appetite, hiding an entire second life behind a closed bedroom door, does not stay contained for long once it reaches print. Once that image left Gallen's pages, it began traveling on its own, and every culture that picked it up reshaped it slightly further. The word ghoul first appeared in English literature in 1786 inside William Beckford's Gothic novel Vathek, a story steeped in the same fascination with the exotic East that had made Gallen's translation such a sensation decades earlier. Beckford pushed the creature even further from its origins, placing its home underground for what appears to be the first time in any major retelling, a detail that would not become a common trait of the ghoul again for well over a century afterward. By the 1800s, English writers were already using the word loosely, sometimes not even to describe a supernatural creature at all, but as an insult for a gravedigger who seemed a little too comfortable around the dead, or for a doctor whose methods of acquiring bodies for study raised uncomfortable questions among neighbors. The graveyard association Galland had introduced had, within roughly a century, swallowed nearly every other trait the original creature once carried. The next major transformation came from a single writer working in the early 20th century, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, whose stories reimagined ghouls as an entire subterranean race living beneath cities and old cemeteries, intelligent, capable of speech, and once human themselves before some transformation pulled them underground and away from the living world for good. This version stripped away the desert entirely and replaced it with tunnels and forgotten catacombs, yet it kept something of the original unease intact, the idea of something that used to be one of us and is not anymore. From there, the leap into 20th century horror cinema and pulp fiction was short. Writers and filmmakers folded the ghoul into an emerging category of undead creatures alongside vampires and the newly invented cinematic zombie, and the crossover became permanent once George Romero's Night of the Living Dead reshaped what mainstream audiences pictured whenever anyone said flesh-eating creature, a shuffling, grave-adjacent figure that owed at least part of its imagery to the very translation Galland had produced 2 centuries earlier. Once tabletop role-playing games and later video games arrived, the ghoul was assigned stats, weaknesses, and a fixed place in a bestiary sitting right beside werewolves and other familiar monsters. And it was only a matter of time before a certain post-apocalyptic wasteland series borrowed the name for its own irradiated survivors, a version so far removed from the original that a comment section can now joke about it without anyone noticing the disconnect. By the time most people alive today first heard the word, whether through a game, a film, or exactly that kind of comment section joke, almost nothing of the desert, the hooves, or Amina and her single grain of rice remained. It is also worth noting that this story has not entirely stopped evolving, even now. Recent English translations of the wider collection have gone back to re-examine exactly how much Galland altered or invented along the way, restoring context and nuance that earlier Victorian-era translations often stripped out or distorted for their own audiences. A reminder that even a centuries-old tale can still be read with fresh eyes. So why does any of this matter beyond simple trivia? Every monster a culture keeps retelling tends to be doing some kind of work, and the ghoul was never an exception. For the communities who first told these stories, long-distance travel across Arabia carried real and constant danger, and a creature that preyed specifically on that vulnerability, on trust extended to a stranger at exactly the wrong moment, functioned as something closer to a survival lesson passed down through fear than a simple scare told around a fire for entertainment. But the story of Sidi Numan pushes the idea even further. It takes the danger out of the open desert entirely and places it inside a marriage, inside a shared home, suggesting that the most unsettling monster was never really the one waiting out on the road. It was the one already sitting across the table, eating in a way that should have been the first warning sign all along. That shift, from an external threat you might meet once on a journey to an intimate one you live beside every day, is probably the real reason this particular version of the ghoul outlasted almost every other detail attached to the creature.
A monster in the desert is frightening for as long as the journey lasts. A monster that could be sitting across the dinner table stays with you far longer than that, because the danger is no longer confined to some unfamiliar place out there. It asks you to reconsider somewhere you already believed was safe.
The next time someone brings up ghouls expecting a rotting wanderer from a video game, you will know the real story runs far deeper than that. Through a Syrian storyteller nearly written out of history, a caliph listening patiently to a strange and quiet confession, and a single grain of rice picked up with a pin, one at a time, by someone who was never quite what she appeared to be.